The snowstorm hit without warning, a brutal curtain of white swallowing the landscape. Even the most seasoned travelers would have sought shelter, and for 3 strangers this necessity forced their paths to cross. The first to arrive was Henry, a grizzled outdoorsman. He trudged through the knee-deep snow, teeth chattering, until he stumbled upon the cabin. Its dark wooden exterior was barely visible against the onslaught of snow. The second was Sarah, a city dweller ill-equipped for the harsh elements. Her fashionable winter coat did little to ward off the biting cold. Lastly, there was Tom, a reserved and introspective man whose quiet demeanor masked a lifetime of hardship. They met at the cabin's entrance, eyeing each other warily. The storm was merciless, and their unspoken truce was born of necessity. Inside, the cabin offered a fleeting warmth, a deceptive respite from the chaos outside. The cabin was quaint but furnished with an unsettling array of old hunting trophies and faded photographs. A single fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls. The trio quickly established a tense camaraderie, each grateful for the other's company amidst the growing storm. Hours passed. They talked little, the howling wind and creaking timbers providing a somber soundtrack. It was Henry who first suggested they introduce themselves properly to pass the time. "I'm Henry," he said gruffly, poking at the fire. "I was out hunting when the storm hit. Didn't expect it to get this bad." Sarah hugged her knees on the sofa, her breath visible in the chilly air. "I'm Sarah. I was driving to a friend's cabin but got lost. Then my car broke down." Tom nodded from his seat at the table, where he absently traced patterns in the dust. "Tom, just passing through." An uneasy silence settled over them again, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the relentless wail of the wind. As night fell, the temperature dropped further. They were forced to move closer to the fire. Shadows danced around them, growing longer and more sinister as the flames waned. Sarah suggested they tell stories to keep their spirits up. Henry went first, sharing a tale about a near-fatal bear encounter. Tom followed with a somber story about his father, lost to the elements on a similar night. When it was Sarah's turn, she hesitated, then recounted a strange experience she'd had as a child. "There was this old woman," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "She lived alone in a cabin not too different from this one. People said she was a witch. One night, my friends dared me to knock on her door. I did, and she answered. Her eyes, I've never seen eyes like that. Cold, empty. She just stared at me and said, 'You'll be back.'" Sarah shivered at the memory. "I ran all the way home. I never saw her again, but I've had nightmares about her ever since." A chill settled over the room that had nothing to do with the temperature. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if it were a living thing trying to communicate. It was then that they heard the scratching. At first it was so faint they thought it might be their imagination, but as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more insistent. The sound was coming from beneath the floorboards. Henry grabbed a poker from the fireplace and stood, motioning for Tom and Sarah to stay back. He moved to the trapdoor in the corner of the room, hidden beneath a dusty rug. The scratching was louder now, frantic. With a deep breath, Henry wrenched the door open. Darkness yawned below, the smell of damp earth and decay wafting up. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Henry replied, his grip tightening on the poker, "but we need to stay together." Tom, usually silent, spoke up. "We should leave. Now." Henry shook his head. "In this storm, we'd never make it. Whatever it is, we face it together." Reluctantly, they agreed, huddling closer to the fire. Minutes turned to hours, and the storm raged on. Sleep was impossible. Every creak and groan of the cabin set their nerves on edge. Around midnight, the scratching resumed, this time accompanied by a low, guttural moan. It sounded almost human, yet not quite. The three exchanged terrified glances, fear rooting them to their spots. "We have to see what it is," Tom said, his voice barely audible. With no other options, they descended into the cellar. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. Henry led the way, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. The scratching grew louder as they neared the back of the cellar, where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. Pushing it open, they found a small, cramped room. At its center was a well ancient and covered in moss. The scratching was coming from inside it. With a sense of dread, Henry shone his light down the well. The beam illuminated a pair of eyes, glinting in the darkness. "Help me," a voice rasped from the depths. It was a whisper, barely audible over the storm. "Please." Sarah backed away, her face pale. "We need to go. Now." But it was too late. The thing in the well moved, clawing its way up the stones with impossible speed. Henry swung the poker, but the creature was upon him before he could react. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, with pale, leathery skin stretched over its bones. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. The creature's bony fingers wrapped around Henry's throat, lifting him off the ground with unnatural strength. Tom and Sarah could only watch in horror as it squeezed, the sickening sound of bones snapping echoing in the small space. Henry's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The creature turned its gaze to Tom and Sarah, who were frozen in terror. "Run!" Tom shouted, pushing Sarah towards the stairs. They scrambled up, the creature close behind. They burst into the main room, slamming the trapdoor shut and dragging furniture over it. "We can't stay here," Sarah sobbed. "We have to get out." Tom nodded, grabbing his coat. "We'll make a run for it. Stick together." As they stepped outside, the storm hit them with full force. The snow was blinding, the wind howling like a banshee. They stumbled through the drifts, the cabin shrinking behind them. But the creature was relentless. It burst through the door, moving with terrifying speed across the snow. Sarah tripped, and Tom pulled her to her feet, but the creature was almost upon them. Desperation fueled their flight, but it was futile. The creature lunged, dragging Sarah back into the snow. Tom turned helpless as her screams were cut short. He ran, his breath ragged, until he couldn't run anymore. The storm swallowed him, the creature's haunting moan echoing in his ears. He stumbled upon a small cave and collapsed inside, praying for the storm to end. Morning came, but the storm had not ceased. Exhausted and numb, Tom ventured back to the cabin, hoping against hope that the creature was gone. What he found was worse than he could have imagined. The cabin was intact, the storm still raging, but inside there was no sign of Henry or Sarah, only the creature, waiting, its hollow eyes watching him from the shadows. Tom knew then that the cabin was a trap, a hunter's den, and they had been its prey. As he felt the creature's icy grip close around him, he realized that the storm would never end. The cabin wouldn't let it. The snow-covered cabin stood, a silent sentinel in the storm, forever waiting for its next victims.